This episode, I'm joined by Ben Turner, who is a senior lecturer in political theory in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. His work covers questions relating to technology, work, ideology, and ontology. In this episode, we talk about his recently published book, Returning to Judgment, Bernard Stiegler and Continental Political Theory. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, as it runs off patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Ben Turner, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
We are going to be discussing your book, Returning to Judgment, Bernard Stiegler and Continental Political Theory, which was published, was it last year?
This year, in March this year.
March this
2023.
year. Published by SUNY, SUNY Press, who I should say were kind enough to send me a copy, so big thank you to them. And as people will imagine, this is a book on the philosophy of Bernard Stiegler, focusing on his continental political thought, drawing from Deleuze, Derrida, a host of other figures. And as I was saying to you before we started, Ben, Stiegler is someone who people have been asking about, like, can you do an episode on this guy? Because he's like still outside, sort of not outside the canon, but he's known by people who are really into philosophy. And I think it's someone that people are like, we need to get the ball rolling. And you know, really, really interesting figure, really, really interesting biography, which maybe we'll touch on. But before we jump in with the ideas of Stiegler, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how it was you came to write this book.
Yeah, thanks. So I teach political theory at the University of Kent. So my into Stiegler was through kind of trying to deal with some of the political issues with his work. So I come at it primarily as a political theorist rather than a philosopher. But actually, as I read Stiegler, I became more and more interested in the philosophical issues that underpin some of the political significance of his work. So I actually started working on Stiegler at the very beginning of my PhD, which I started in 2013. So I've been working on Stiegler for some 10 years now. And I started kind of really being interested in questions of subjectivity, and in particular, how he fitted into a kind of broader set of views on post-industrial subjectivity and how this impacts our engagement with politics. So broadly situated in political social theory, some of the work that's kind of done in the autonomous tradition, sort of interested in his place within those sorts of debates. But as I worked through Stiegler's writing, I felt they had something to say to continental political theory more broadly than thinkers that were just engaged in these kinds of discussions. And in particular, he helped me tap into something which had always been kind of troubling me about the attempt to move from the critique of metaphysics and the critique of humanism into ontology as a kind of methodological move, which is common in kind of post-structuralism, which follows Deleuze and Foucault, but also kind of other forms of post-foundational thought, that you can use ontology and a post-foundational kind of ontology to overcome the problems of metaphysics. We might talk about this later on when we talk about the book, but I started off being interested in this kind of more concrete kind of issue of subjectivity in kind of post-industrial kind of society, and then moved into actually these kind of more foundational issues for concepts of the political in the continental tradition. And so in the thesis, I sort of started to tackle this in terms of the role that anthropology plays in Stiegler's work. And there's an interesting kind of role that anthropological thinkers play. And then after I finished the PhD, I sort of became interested in the concept of judgment or political decision, which was nascent in the thesis, but actually became the kind of organizing factor of the book. So it has its origins in two kind of drives, effectively, to sort of try and understand Stiegler's significance for political theory and to make that a bit more widely accessible. So hopefully the book makes sense of Stiegler, who can be an intimidating thinker, and then to try and articulate Stiegler from a kind of continental perspective and think about his significance for some of the dominant ways of using ontology within that tradition. So those are two quite different aims, but I actually think Stiegler kind of provides a way in to the second one, but you need to do the work of the first to get there. Sort of I had mulled over the idea of this being two books, but you have to assume that someone had read the first to read the second. So they kind of came together. So after that, I've just sort of become a little bit more open in my work. And kind of the book ends up at the place where we shouldn't shy away as continental thinkers from making more concrete judgments, as we sort of tend to do. And so in my work, I try and sort of do some of that with respect to technological change, epistemic agency, and the politics of work in particular, in a way which is kind of interconnected. And in particular, I'm kind of interested in finding interesting connections between Stiegler and analytic work in these fields, which actually I think address some of the issues that he is really interested in a very different language, but in a way which is applied in a way that I think he would be very, very kind of keen on. So that's kind of the book is sort of the in-between between where I started and the work I'm doing now, if that makes sense. So I feel very much that the work I'm doing now is not a new project that follows it, but sort of the logical culmination of where the book kind of brought me intellectually through Stiegler's work. If that doesn't sound too pretentious as a kind of way of thinking about my intellectual trajectory.
No. It makes sense. The understanding that, especially within Continental thought, beginning from an interest in the concrete and then having to not revert, but say go back to these foundational philosophical issues. I think it is a common thing, especially within the Continentals. And as you say, I mean, towards the end of the book, the risk of being a continental thinker and being within continental philosophy and making concrete judgments. I mean, that's a risky position, especially within this framework of like Derrida's post-structuralism, especially. So I commend you for that. But before we and I commend the book for that. But before we move forward, of course, I have to ask you the Hermitix question. You can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Bernard Stiegler is already sat in the room waiting. Who do you pick?
Yeah, so I'm always terrible at these kinds of questions. I tend to overthink them. So my first answer is a little bit simplistic. The overthinking led me to the simple question, and it's kind of a cheat. It's sort of two in one. So the first would be Plato or Socrates, depending on how you want to take that answer, mainly because Stiegler, I think in some ways sees himself as continuing a kind of version of the Socratic project. And he has a subversive reading of Plato. Well, maybe not subversive, and it's subversive in relationship to perhaps, again, Derrida's reading of Plato, but I would be interested to see how that conversation happens, right? How Stiegler kind of says, yeah, Plato's the first thinker of ideology, for example. This is one of the kind of controversial things that Stiegler says, and to try and actually make sense of whether that continuity that he tries to establish works. So that's kind of the first one, a little bit of a grand gesture. The second actually kind of goes back to what I was just saying about some work in analytic philosophy that I think is really bordering on what Stiegler says. So I've been reading a lot of this work in epistemology and philosophy of language. It's difficult to choose one thinker, but one that I think might have interesting things to talk about with Stiegler is Sally Haslanger. In particular, her work on ideology and how ideology shapes the way we think and the way we perceive. And in particular, something she says about looping effects in culture has a lot in common with what Stiegler takes from Simondon around individuation and how individuation changes the conditions of future individuation in a way which is kind of recursive and ongoing. And I think actually there's a lot of common ground between a set of discussions about language and semantics and pragmatics that we wouldn't usually think Stiegler would be interested in, and the way Stiegler uses a thinker like Simondon. So that would be my second choice, kind of a contemporary thinker that I think is ploughing a different furrow, but towards similar kind of aims and with similar interests. And then the third is sort of doing the same thing I do with Plato. The third would be Deleuze, actually, because Stiegler's often presented as kind of a member of the Derridian tradition, that he was a student of Derrida. He starts off in his early work by working through Derrida. The first volume, Text and Time, deals with Derrida more concretely. But I tried to find the reference before we started the recording, but I couldn't quite find it. But there is somewhere, and I think it might be in States of Shock, where he says basically, I'm more of a Deleuzian than I am a Derridian. And it's kind of an interesting moment. That was an interesting moment for me intellectually, because I'd kind of always read him through this dominant view that he's Derridian, but actually, I think he is perhaps more of a Deleuzian thinker than a Derridian, but he breaks very strongly with some of the key things that Deleuze says. So again, a bit like how I would like to see how that attempt to continue a kind of Platonic or Socratic project lands in Stiegler. The same for this kind of claim that he is in some ways Deleuzian, but despite the fact he breaks, I think, with some of the commitments he has. How does that kind of work through? So I guess two of those people are, how does he work through his predecessors? That probably comes from my interest as someone who's trying to figure out why and how Stiegler says what he's saying, but another one thinking about his contemporaries and actually sort of what is it we can do with his thought, particularly with Hausdanger. So yeah, so that's my three thinkers, maybe slightly kind of intellectually oriented. But yeah.
Could you, just as an aside, I mean, could you expand on what you mean when you say he's continuing the Socratic project?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So in the chapter on pharmacology, I sort of have a small kind of passage on this, but basically, when he's reading Plato, he's kind of saying that what the kind of whole deal with writing is about in the Phaedrus, and in particular in the context of Derrida's reading of the Phaedrus, is not so much a condemnation of writing. It is partially that, but it's also an attempt to think through the effects of writing on the polis, or on the community, on the state, on politics. And he says, obviously, Derrida is aware of this, but Derrida is kind of more interested in these broader kind of claims and discussions about metaphysics and methodology, whereas Stiegler's kind of saying, well, actually, what Socrates is really trying to do is kind of think through, or in his discussion, in the Phaedrus, he's trying to develop a way to understand and kind of respond to the impact of writing, as opposed to think through its philosophical conditions. And I think he sees himself as doing this with respect to Technics, but on this kind of long historical kind of view, but also in a contextual view. If that makes sense as a way of thinking about the differences, that he's invested obviously in the wider philosophical claim about what Technics is, but there's also this kind of practical slant to the way he develops those answers. How can we solve concrete problems? So the interesting kind of question there is, does he do this in a way which be acceptable to kind of Plato / Socrates, depending on how you read the dialogues?
Okay. I mean, we're sort of tiptoeing around the figure, and as this is the first episode on this podcast on Stiegler, and hopefully there'll be many more. I imagine many people might have heard his name, but some might not have heard of him at all, because he passed away. Was it 2020?
Yeah, in August 2020.
So who was this? Who was this philosopher? Who was this man, Bernard Stiegler?
Yeah, so in the broadest terms, he was a philosopher of technology. That's one way of understanding him. His kind of most significant books are part of a 3-part series called Technics and Time. As you can tell, there's a Heideggerian influence there. But he worked broadly, due to this Heideggerian influence, in the continental tradition of philosophy. And one way of kind of situating him is that he's part of a wave of kind of what's sometimes called post-continental or new French philosophers. Ian James comes up with this term, new French philosophers. So this group of thinkers inherit broadly post-war continental French philosophy and try to push it in new directions. So often one of the contrasts, Ian James makes this contrast between kind of a poetic approach to philosophy and a sort of attempt to bring in kind of more scientific or technical kind of elements into that point of view. So Stiegler kind of is there because of his interest in technicity. But someone like Catherine Malibu or Alain Badiou might kind of fit in this because of their interest in neuroscience and set theory, respectively. But Stiegler kind of is primarily a philosopher, but as his work goes on, he focuses increasingly on the political implications of his ideas, and in particular within the context of kind of big kind of picture issues. Later in his work, we have kind of issues like climate change, earlier on the culture industry, and kind of forms of kind of capitalist culture. And then in later work, this becomes an interest in algorithms and algorithmic governance. And this political turn sort of broadly comes in the early 2000s, where he starts to write with increasing kind of frequency on political issues. So across his work, he becomes increasingly interested in sort of the relationship between technology and kind of their deleterious effects on social and political systems. So he's primarily a philosopher, but he works in a kind of political tradition. Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned his interesting biography. So he has this kind of interesting route into philosophy that's sort of one of these kind of myths or kind of legends, I think, in a weird way. So he kind of was familiar with philosophy broadly, or loosely studied philosophy kind of as someone involved in sort of Marxist politics. But it's not until after he goes to prison and is incarcerated for committing bank robbery that he begins to actually study philosophy fully and kind of in earnest. And he kind of says it's this isolation. He is influenced by Husserl, and this kind of act of epoche, suspension of the world, is something he kind of applies to his experience in prison, that it's this removal from the world that he is able to actually kind of properly philosophize, which is really interesting. So after this, he starts studying in prison, and he does some kind of teaching and begins studying by correspondence. He works with Derrida and Lyotard on his doctoral dissertation on release. And this is what became Technics and Time. So his doctoral work, I think, so it changed across time as he developed and expanded it. Was going to be, I think, at final count, 6 volumes of Technics and Time. We ended up with 3. There's a draft for 4th. I don't know what the status of that is. I'm not sure about the 5th or 6th. I don't think there are manuscripts for those. So he has this kind of big kind of work that then, and this is why the political stuff is so important, actually, because he kind of says this is more important than just the philosophical kind of tome that is the backbone of everything I'm trying to do. So it's this interesting route into philosophy, but he also, for much of his career, occupies a sort of para-academic space. So he did occupy kind of university positions, but he also occupied positions at kind of cultural institutes, most famously the Pompidou Center. So he works with academics and collaborated with them, sorry, but in many ways in kind of not traditional academic spaces. So he founded the Center for Cultural Research and Innovation at the Pompidou in 2005, the political group Ars Industrialis in 2006, who had worked on what was called the Pleine Commune project, which did community work in Paris suburbs, and then the Internation Collective in 2018, all of which tried to kind of marry a kind of philosophical concern for technicity with active political engagement. So he sort of occupies a space in this French tradition of public intellectual, but perhaps in a even less formally philosophical way than someone like Sartre, for example.
Does that radicality, just from the bank robbing and the early Marxist radicality, I mean, do you feel that leaves him, or does he just find a new way to sort of appropriate that into his way of life and into his thought?
That's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting question because in some ways he's been read or viewed or interpreted as a bit of a conservative because of some of the ways he talks through politics and technicity. I say conservative with a small c there, not a big C. But I think there is something of the radicality in there in the sense that he thinks there is a need for urgent action. in most of his thoughts. So I think that's a good way of reading the continuity between the early and the late Stiegler. I don't think I'd really thought about it like that before. So I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, we mentioned the words technics and technicity, which get thrown around occasionally within philosophy. I mean, it's a pretty broad question just to open up the philosophy specifically. But what are technics and technicity for Stiegler?
Yeah. So the simplest answer is they're tools, but it's important to distinguish techniques and technology. So sometimes in discussions of Stiegler, the two become conflated. So technology is the kind of rationalized and extended use of something that he calls techniques. So techniques or technicity, in its kind of simplest definition for him, is a form of externalized memory. It's a way that we take forms of memory and solidify or concretize or externalize them in physical forms. Now, they don't always have to be physical. I've just immediately gone back on my definition there, but they involve a kind of a practical kind of transmissibility. So sometimes this is physical, sometimes this is through kind of social interaction and communication, but the kind of sort of paradigm case is a sort of physical object. So across his work, he gives us different names. People will be familiar with these depending on which of his work they've read, but sometimes he calls it epiphylogenesis. Sometimes he calls it tertiary retention. Sometimes it's the organized inorganic. But broadly, he distinguishes kind of memory from two other kinds of memory. So biological memory, so the memory of the species, or kind of the memory of the individual components that make up the individual on a biological level, that's kind of reproduced through sexual reproduction. And then what he calls kind of individual memory. So, or kind of a psychic memory of an individual that typically in the rest of the animal kingdom is lost with death. So there are certain kind of memories which cannot be passed on beyond death, but what technicity allows humans, and we can talk about the use of the word humans later on, it allows humans to pass on those individual memories that would otherwise be lost in death to other members of the species. So where biological memory is retained, individual memory can be passed on through technicity because it's either sort of part of a broader practice which other individuals can engage in, or it's externalized in a kind of concrete form. So that's the most basic definition that Stiegler gives. The broader definition then is that what these forms of tools, or what technicity does, is frame and shape the way we interact with the world by forming a kind of frame through which individuals engage with other humans, but also with their experience more broadly. So it's a kind of simple tool, but is also this thing which constitutes human experience. If that makes sense.
It does. So to draw in three elements that we've actually spoken about already, this notion of technics as a memory of the externalization of an internal memory, if I'm getting that correct, into a tool, or I guess so. Internal memory becomes external techniques, which also is within solidified technology as well. Somewhat.
Yep.
Yeah. This seems to me to be almost like an extreme appropriation of Socrates' disdain for writing. And also to draw in that conservatism, is Stiegler sort of sympathetic with Socrates' opinion of writing, as everything should be the oral method and you should learn by memory, but applied to this much broader expanse of techniques as a whole throughout culture, that we should approach more in that Socratic way? Is that where we might find his conservatism, or am I off the track there?
No, I mean, so I don't think you're off track. I mean, I would disagree. But there's a reason why I don't think you're off track. So there's a kind of philosophical and a political element to this problem. So philosophically, Stiegler would reject a kind of technophobia, right, of the kind you just described. The reason for that is he argues that this externalization sort of sounds like we're kind of losing something. And this is one of the, I think, problems of language that we get in Stiegler's work, that this language of externalization. But we might want to think it more as a kind of preservation through externalization. The kind of other philosophical reason is that there is no human without technics. This is the kind of controversial, almost quasi-evolutionary claim that he makes, that this is the thing which distinguishes humans from other living organisms, is that our capacities are shaped through the memories that we can access via techniques. So the simplest example to take writing is that you and I, as people interested in philosophy or politics, can engage with with thinkers like Plato through the inheritance of written text, and that this provides us with additional kinds of capacities or the ability to engage with something which is enriching. So in that respect, Technics is the foundation of all human kind of culture, in that basic sense. So the first kind of response is that he would not agree that it's something which we simply have to kind of reject in response, in favoring oral culture, because he would kind of say, well, actually, oral culture is itself a kind of tool, because it involves, again, words which we shape and which we pass on, which also tends to rely on some kind of written kind of support in many contexts as well. So the first answer is a kind of philosophical claim that actually Technics is this constitutive externalization, that we still re-internalize through the use of techniques, and it's this interplay which is what makes us human. The political answer is that he's also closer to the kind of Socratic view in the Phaedrus, is because they aren't, or technics, sorry, where I say technics isn't necessarily benevolent, but it's not necessarily negative either. So he adopts this, what he calls pharmacological perspective, which he takes from Derrida's reading of the Phaedrus, that basically all technical tools have both curative and poisonous tendencies, and that what matters is the way we use them as opposed to the use of them at all. So this is where he reads Socrates in the Phaedrus as kind of a bit more pragmatic than solely rejecting writing. And there's this citation he takes out where it's not writing that's the problem; it's using it shamefully. Right? This critique of sophistry that kind of Plato is invested in across his work, and the impact of sophistry on the public sphere, using writing in a way which has a negative impact on our public institutions, basically. This is what Stiegler is concerned with when it comes to the political impact of technicity. So he's both saying it's constitutive, but we have to be careful about where we use it. So some of the language he uses when he talks about that political dimension, people have read as being somewhat conservative. But I don't think it's because of a technophobia, even though it can be interpreted as that.
Okay. Yeah, that does make sense. Okay. But there's been a mention there of, I guess, when we say humans, the other term, which is sort of key at the beginning of your text when you move through to the political, is like we have technicity on one hand, and then we have the human and the notion that the human really is a fiction. It's not what we think it is. So why could we say the human isn't real, or is there a difference between reality and fiction, or irreality and fiction? I mean, why does Stiegler have a problem with the human?
Yeah. So I've been using this word human, and the elephant in the room is that he doesn't like the word human, right? He uses this slightly complex terminology which he calls the non-inhuman. So I guess I'll take the question of the fiction before kind of moving into that term. So the reason why Stiegler thinks the human is a fiction is really a kind of direct result of this constitutive relationship between the human and technicity. Effectively, what this relationship to technicity does is prevent us from kind of falling back on any kind of ahistorical definition of the human. This is for a number of reasons. I guess two are really important, but the first is, well, technicity is this kind of empirically changing and contingent set of artifice. And this, as the transmission of human culture, it kind of shapes and frames how we think. So what it means to be human in those contexts will depend on the kind of largely kind of accidental set of technical kind of relationships that shape that context. So the concept of the human as a sort of genetic kind of entity, right, defined by certain genetic traits, is a product of a particular kind of set of technological capacities that we develop in the kind of late modern period, for example. And that changes the way we think about what the human is. So when he says the human is a fiction, he's sort of not trying to say it doesn't exist as such, but that we give it meaning through the sort of cultural values which we attach to it. So the kind of footnote there is he's not trying to say that, you know, science is wrong or science is false necessarily, right? He's not trying to, it's not a kind of strict relativism, right? Well, the human is meaningless and we can call it whatever we want, but that nevertheless still plays a role in constructing a broad narrative about what we think the human is at a certain point in time. The second reason for this is comes in the first volume of Technics and Time, what he calls the default of origin. And this is, I think, quite important because basically through a reading of Rousseau, in fact, and another kind of French anthropologist called André Leroi-Roquan, I can never pronounce his name properly, apologies for that. Basically, he argues that when we think about the origin of the human, we're always thinking about a kind of paradox or aporia, that if technicity constitutes the human, we have this kind of paradoxical moment where we kind of get what comes first, a chicken and the egg sort of decision. He kind of errs on the side of a sort of gradualist evolutionary explanation where tools and kind of the human physiology emerge together. But he still kind of says, well, the cutting off point at which we determine that we become human is quite difficult in that context. And effectively, it's almost impossible for us to pinpoint that origin. So the very thing which causes the origin of the human, technicity, is the thing which makes it impossible for us to think about the origin in kind of ahistorical terms. So this default of origin means that, well, when we understand what it means to be human, even in a kind of scientific evolutionary perspective, we're doing it from within a particular framework, from within a particularly kind of technically determined set of contexts. So it's both a kind of what we might call a broad contextualist argument, his claim about the human being a fiction, that's probably fairly familiar to people working within post-structuralist tradition in particular, but it's also a kind of claim which engages with scientific accounts of the human or anthropological and evolutionary accounts to then think, actually, what are the ramifications of a kind of gradualist account of the origin of the human? So he says we can refer to something that we call the human, or we have tended to call the human, but in a way which is ahistorical and sort of against purely sort of transcendental readings. So this is why he goes in for this language of the non-inhuman. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first is it allows him to sort of retain the kind of conceptual, I guess, language of something like the human without falling into humanism. He's saying, you know, this is a historical and technically determined phenomenon, this thing that we are. But second, it allows them to bring in this sort of duality between the good and the bad uses of technology, or he calls these two pharmacological tendencies. The tendency towards being inhuman is when we use technicity in a sort of broadly negative way, and we can talk about what that sort of means. And the non-inhuman is what happens when we use that in a productive and positive sense. So it's both the sort of concept which indicates the sort of species that we are, and that species is sort of fictionally defined at different points in time and in different places, but also that it's something we have to actively work to embody. That there are these two sort of dimensions to what it means to be human, and that really the sort of desirable way of being human is what he calls this non-inhuman kind of element of our existence. So there is a slight difference between the human and the non-inhuman. Um, in some ways, they refer to the same thing, but there is a sort of, I guess, a normative in some respects set of baggage that comes with the non-inhuman. There's obviously normative baggage to the language of the human, which why Stiegler moves to the language of the non-inhuman, but it does imply an idea about what we ought to do, even if it's very, very kind of minimal in that sense.
I mean, just out of interest, this notion of what you defined as a broad contextualist definition of the human. Does he apply this sort of struggle to define in relation to origin and where it comes from, in relation to the fact that you're amidst technics and the constant redefinition of what it is to be that thing at all? Does he apply that to other sort of say sort of grand signifiers such as nature, society, whatever it might be? Are these things also caught within that same ongoing contextualization of their existence?
Yeah, so I mean, the way I read Stiegler is that these kinds of concepts are historically determined. So, right, so the concept of nature changes, and it's this technical kind of frame which gives meaning to these sorts of terms. So, what we call society is sort of one technically supported kind of concept through which we mediate our experience. Nature doesn't play as much of a role in the framework of his philosophy. The social or society kind of does, within the concept of organology. So he kind of says basically there's these three kind of elements of human experience: the biological, the technical, and the social. And it's the interaction between these three things which shape these kinds of contexts or these frames, but that they all are kind of they all co-constitute one another in the context of the human. So we can't think about our biological function aside from how they interact with technology. And the same for the social. All three of these things kind of interact together. I think the interesting thing to think about here is kind of diet, right? That food seems to be such a kind of primal way of, or essential biological kind of way of thinking about the human. We have to eat for certain kind of biological functions to work. But it's also impossible really to think about any kind of diet which is not mediated by technical and social conventions. So the social, this kind of I think is useful here because it helps us think about the social broadly as kind of just commonly held kind of conceptions and relationships, or ideas of relationships, as opposed to anything as strong as society as a sort of concept. But also that when it comes to the human, what we typically would call nature is always mediated by technics and society. But I think this is aside from nature as a whole, as a kind of realm of existence, if that makes sense. In the later work, there's an attempt, I think, to flatten this a bit more when he starts talking about entropy and thermodynamics. But I think there is still a sort of question over how he thought about the relationship between nature more widely and kind of human technical existence.
Well, I guess we have this sort of huge foundation, the sort of Stieglerian foundation. It seems, if you have heard of him, these are the primary concepts you would have come across. This, I think, is enough of a foundation to move into one of the more central theses of your book, which is to do with political judgment, because we have this, human, we have technics, and then from that we have the inhuman, like going towards the inhuman in, I guess, judgment and decision making, politically speaking, and then also going towards a more productive way of thinking about it. And once again, you sort of mentioned that it doesn't really seem to be like a morality. Maybe it is an ethics, but how from this foundation? But basically, the question is how from this foundation that you've given thus far can productive judgments in one way which benefit humanity, whatever that is, politically speaking, how can we begin to form this type of political judgment from this inhuman-human divide which Stiegler has sort of built?
Yeah, I hope that's a useful foundation. I find to explain one element of Stiegler's work, you often fall back on other concepts. It's sort of a product of how he writes. So yeah, I hope it's clear. I mean, I think it's probably worth just restating that in some ways to answer this question about the transition to useful judgment. So the broad claim is that there's this constitutive relationship between technics and the human, and technicity shapes how we think, act, and behave because it forms this kind of field of inheritable ideas that constitute human existence. And that on the one hand, then we have basically a kind of openness to the human, in that our existence is modifiable in some way because of the contingency of technicity, but also then a tendency towards closure, in that, well, these are kind of determined conditions on which we do think and act and behave. So in the first sense, Stiegler inherits a kind of broadly post-structuralist or approach characteristic of continental theory, where we think about the human as something which is sort of this open historical product of changing cultural norms. And he sort of adds his twist to that with technicity, basically. He sort of carries through with that tradition. So everything we've kind of spoken about in the first half is sort of broadly pursuing that kind of aim. How can we think about the human in this open historical sense? But he does want to retain the sort of language of the human, even if it is in the form of the non-inhuman, which others are typically tend to be more hesitant about. But he also wants to retain something of the value of these technical frameworks which shape our existence. And that actually these aren't just a sort of constraint upon the openness of the human. They aren't just a way of constraining, defining, hemming in, but also they are the thing which provide meaning in a way which grants us the forms of agency and value that we think are important as human beings. So actually he thinks there's this interesting tension between what I in the book call non-totalization, a kind of political approach which wants to emphasize these historical components of our existence, and totalization, that, well, those historical components actually define and give meaning in a way which is really important and useful. And so this is where Stiegler's work is really interesting, because he wants to say, we've got to find a political balance between these two tendencies, right? That on the one hand, openness is really important because rejecting openness kind of leads us into the trap of defining the human in a way which comes with the sort of political problems that we've seen, right? Exclusions of particular groups, leading all the way up to kind of potentially genocidal kind of consequences. But he says openness in and of itself doesn't really give us anything. It doesn't really give us anything as a kind of political compass or anything to orient us as we move forward and face new problems. So we also need kind of what I'm again referring to the book as kind of totalizing judgments which give meaning to the sort of openness at the heart of the human. And that there's an interplay between these two elements in Stiegler's work, rather than an emphasis on the open. So what he would call a kind of pharmacologically curative judgment, what in other language he would call a non-inhuman kind of judgment, is a way of totalizing and giving meaning to a sort of contingent set of circumstances in a way which leaves the kind of window open, so to speak, for transformation or new forms of judgment or engagements and decisions with that totalizing set of circumstances. The contrast then is, and I think it's easier to understand what he's trying to say is politically positive through the contrast with the politically negative, is that the non-inhuman, it tends to arise from judgments which close this space down, which basically say, this is kind of the answer, this is what this is, that have a strongly naturalizing tendency without any scope really for engaging with the decisions and judgments that take place. So I can give you an example which sort of derives mainly from actually his later kind of, well, not just his later, but his political engagements with capitalism, right? So he says what capitalism does is totalize our conception of human ends, right? That our conception of ends is typically tied to the profit motive. It's typically tied to notions of efficiency and sort of rationalization, that we can rationalize, make things more efficient so that profit can be generated, and that this is a value in and of itself beyond kind of other human ends. In that respect, he's fairly in line, I think, with most kind of critiques of capitalism you find within continental philosophy. But that's the kind of clearly negative example. But what he kind of says is, well, he doesn't say it in these words, but basically, we can't leave the totalization and the judging to people who don't really care about plurality. The problem, he says, with this kind of continental valorization of openness in and of itself is it doesn't provide alternatives in a strong sense, right? It sort of says, well, openness is good and we have an ethics of transformation and these sorts of things, which are, I think, at the time, useful political interventions. But then he says what they've left us with is a legacy where we can't provide alternatives, right, to the totalization of ends by capitalism. Mm-hmm. And so what the non-inhuman and this kind of pharmacologically curative judgment is about is trying to maintain this openness within a kind of totalizing claim that might challenge existing ideas about what it means to be human. Mm. So it's difficult to give an example because I think, well, actually, no, I can give an example. One of a positive judgment, because I'll give you an example of a negative judgment. Some of the work he did with Pleine Commune in Saint Denis in Paris was to sort of work through screen addiction in children. So part of the project was kind of clinics and kind of workshops to work through these kinds of issues in a way which was participatory in its nature. Right? But this is a kind of explicit judgment on what is good. Mm-hmm. Right? It's an explicit claim that engagement with these sorts of devices can lead to severe problems. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, this isn't in his written philosophy. This is a practical kind of project, but I think it's a sort of judgment which is about enhancing participation and ability to engage with the kinds of political and social contexts that people are navigating, mm-hmm. as opposed to just making a claim which is, you shouldn't be doing this, so stop doing it. Right, which you do find, right, that people say just don't do it, just don't give your child an iPad, right, which is a lot different to actively engaging in setting up kind of practices where people can engage with and learn from that process. We can otherwise engage with the success or not of these types of projects, but that's the kind of thing that Stiegler is thinking about as positive political judgment, that thinks about shaping the non-inhuman in a way which is both open and totalizing.
So it seems like the notions of totalizing and non-totalizing have almost a reciprocal relationship with themselves, in the sense that, to go back to your example there of the children with screen addiction, it's like to interject the just don't do it. It's like, well, what does that even really mean? In this, but to go again to critique screen addiction seems to me to be trying to just at least open up a space to say, like, look at the totalization of the addiction itself. So the non-totalization of it is just allowing someone into a more of a non-totalization, whereas it's like an argument against totalization because, well, where are you heading? You're heading towards really like a sort of a dead end. Yeah, but this, when reading your book, this was just as someone who's studied continental philosophy for a long time, it was almost like witnessing someone walk a tightrope. The notion of totalization and concreteness, and especially like concrete alternatives within continental philosophy, especially, is like, that's a risky move. So, I guess I'll ask you that risky question. Outside of the practical example you've given of the screen time, what did he foresee as perhaps a productive trajectory of this vision of how to move forward productively with the balance between non-totalizing and totalizing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, one of the themes which comes out um, in the later work is this concept or kind of language of locality, which I think is really really nice and really important. And again, a theme which highlights the kind of continuity and the non-continuity with his predecessors. Um, so he thinks locality is a concept which he, on one hand, sees a pharmacologically poisonous version of, right? So at one point, he refers to sort of nationalism as a sort of negative version of locality because it's totalizing and exclusionary in a way which is harmful for all the reasons that we might associate um, with nationalism. But he says, well, locality is not just about exclusionary claims, but it's also about a context that is actually formed and shaped by individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And this concept of locality is quite broad or baggy, right? He's not saying it has to be a defined physical space or geographic area. It could be a field of practice,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or at least this is how I read him on locality. That locality could be people across the globe that engage with a particular culture artifact, right? A particular film and they discuss it through online discussion forums or something like that, right? So locality is something like a field of practice that people can engage with in a sort of contributory way. And he thinks through these kinds of contributory practices, we can sort of develop a passage towards universality. Mm. Again, understood in this sort of open sense that by developing sort of these local practices, we can contribute to broader, larger, totalizing claims about what it means to be human that might guide the future, right? That might guide challenges like climate change, how we think about regulating the use of artificial intelligence, for example, and that it's by cultivating this diversity of local practices that we actually generate sort of almost kind of better totalizing universal kind of practices at the same time. So the broader kind of response is that locality is this kind of, I guess, in some way guiding ideal for the practices which we develop. He's also interested in kind of the amateur as a political or conceptual term, that it's by engaging with local practices or with artistic practices that what the amateur does is sort of develop their own individuation and contribute to and become part of that tradition. Mm. And it's through these sorts of practices that we have a kind of thriving culture, and that in fact he uses the language of noodiversity or new diversity. Really by that he just means diversity of thought, that we generate differences in the way we think, and that those differences are productive of better kind of judgments which might guide us in a more general sense. So it's that passage between the local and the universal that he's really interested in later work, and that he thinks where productive politics lies, basically.
Did he comment on contemporary politics as to sort of where we're at in the West with regard to his own philosophy?
Yes and no. I mean, he does. So he's sort of very interested in, I mean, the Anthropocene is the language he uses, but kind of climate change. He's interested in the use of algorithms within kind of governmental and social kind of decisions. He's very interested in culture. Sort of the culture industry is sort of a framing way of thinking about some of the sort of mid-noughties work. But in a way which I don't think was as concrete as sort of he would perhaps suggest we should be doing politics. But actually in a conversation I had with a colleague the other day, they expressed it really nicely, is that in some ways these interventions are ways of thinking through the stuff he started doing practically outside of his writing. Mm. In a way, I don't know whether he felt he needed to write about these things as concretely, although he did write some interventions in op-eds and things like that in the French press. But actually he was kind of doing that practical commentary by engaging in other sorts of practices and things like that. But he's not as directly. If you went to Stiegler thinking I would like a commentary on this particular political event that he may have expressed some interest in, you typically get a view on that through his philosophy, right? And the philosophy tends to be primary in the writings.
And I guess that's why you also found yourself having to go back from the concrete to the foundational aspects of Stiegler's thought.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there anything you'd like to add about your book, just at this juncture, that you feel is key to the discussion that we're having?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that all of this is kind of revolving around, I think it's maybe been bubbling under the discussion, is a sort of a disagreement that I'm saying Stiegler has with Continental thought. And I think explicitly this is a disagreement with people like Deleuze, Derrida, Lyotard, who he sort of says they focus on locality, but they don't really think about this passage to generality. And this sort of a really evocative way he talks about this is the critique of mastery in Derrida. That Stiegler thinks mastery is actually valuable, even though it's potentially unattainable, because it's how we learn and transmit these sort of cultural practices, which might help us develop useful local practices. So he kind of critiques a particular kind of, he sometimes call it the post-68 sort of thought, right? There's a parallel then in my framing of the book with regards to the development of the work of these thinkers he's using into what could be broadly called political ontology in Continental thought, which is effectively basically trying to go from the critique of metaphysics, because totalizing, and the critique of humanism, because totalizing, into a claim that, well, actually, if we want to have a pluralist open politics, one way of doing this is through an appeal to what sort of saying the nature of being is changing or abyssal or constantly in flux, and therefore democracy, or therefore pluralism. I mean, that's a bit of a caricature, but there are sort of two main strands of this. One, which might be called post-foundationalism, which we get in thinkers like Jean-Luc Nancy, Anessa Lacan, Chantal Mouffe, and other kind of associated thinkers. Oliver Marchart is kind of the person who summarized this work the best, I think. And then also I see a parallel in kind of broadly new materialist approaches that sort of flatten agency and attribute it to a kind of whole range of other kind of entities, and that we're always entangled and therefore we can't totalize. So in particular, Jane Bennett and William Connolly in the work of political theory, but also people like Samantha Frost and Diana Kuhl are sort of associated with this broad movement. And I think the broad perspectives behind these views, I don't sort of discuss them at length. I can really frame it in the introduction and deal with it sporadically throughout the first half of the book. Is I think these views have permeated into Continental theory. These are broadly accepted ways of doing Continental thought. I think new materialism as a label has died off, but I think a lot of its basic ideas have become commonplace in some parts of the field. And I think, I have to say this, I think there's a lot of value in this work, right? So I'm not trying to say there's nothing of value in it, but the thing that I have sort of has been kind of the doubt that's played through in my mind is that what makes ontology different to metaphysics, right? What happens when your kind of ontological framework comes up against another ontological framework which doesn't accord with yours, right? And how then do you reconcile your pluralism with that? So I was quite influenced by reading some recent work in anthropology. Well, I say recent, the last 15 years, maybe more. People like Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveros de Castro, who try to kind of reconcile with this kind of fact that there are diverging ontologies, that people schematize the world in sporadically and sometimes incommensurable ways. This was really helpful for me because it made me actually kind of realize, okay, so maybe there's a way to think of these ontologies as similarly totalizing in the same way that metaphysics and humanism were seen to be totalizing, because they present a circumscribed way of thinking about the world. This is the way that pluralism operates because of these claims about the nature of being. So where does this come back to Stiegler? Basically, Stiegler is useful for me because he provides a framework for articulating that critique through technicity. That there's a parallel to his own critique of the post-68 thinkers, to my sort of discomfort about ontological methodology, because if technicity frames thought, that means that philosophical speculation about the nature of ontology is always going to be totalizing and situated in the same way that metaphysics and humanism were critiqued for being totalizing despite their situatedness. So yeah, I think that was maybe that's helpful to mention that, because that's the sort of, I guess, subtext which has been bubbling underneath this kind of mention of the difference between Stiegler and Continental thought, that there's Stiegler's own version of this difference, and there's my sort of parallel understanding, which I use Stiegler to unearth, and then frame the book, even though the book is kind of primarily on Stiegler, if that makes sense. And that might sort of shed a little bit more light on the totalizing, non-totalizing duality.
So, we have terms such as polytheism. I mean, it seems like almost like a polyontology, the foundation of which is a relationship between human and technics, which allows for an eventual undoing of the paradox of differing ontologies.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it would be a question of undoing the paradox. I would just say it's a way of framing the paradox as sort of inevitable, right? That actually there are always going to be these competing frames. I mean, in the book, the language I use that I take from Stiegler is a-transcendental, which is one of these dense pieces of terminology, but actually the idea is fairly simple. It's that there are transcendental frames which structure our experience. Stiegler's sort of, I hesitate to say a Kantian, but he is quite Kantian in particularly in the third volume, Text and Time. But those transcendental frames are empirically and historically determined. So they change through shifts in technicity. And you can think about this through that kind of organological link between biology, technics, and the social that I mentioned earlier, that there are biological determinants to thought, right, that sort of contemporary neuroscience would hold. But Stiegler's argument is, well, they are only kind of actualized through social meaning and technical contexts. So he says there are these like transcendental structures, but they go across the brain and the social and the technical, and therefore they change. So therefore, ontology as a kind of way of thinking about being, I just found it hard to square that this was any different to metaphysics. And Stiegler provided me with a way to kind of to square that circle, so to speak, and actually develop a way of turning that kind of doubt in the back of my head into a kind of framework. Someone, I forget the name, in the literature, it's called him post-ontological as a way of, as a thinker, because he doesn't try to develop an ontology, but can perhaps account for where ontologies come from. And that's kind of how I read him in that context.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about your book that, once again, that we haven't touched on, and I guess also where can we find it?
Okay, what anything I'd like to add? I think if you want to know what Stiegler's about, I hope it's useful. The book tries to present. I mean, I imagine the conversation has been fairly dense, but I think the book tries to present his work in a way which is accessible to people that haven't read him before. If you're broadly familiar with Continental thought, I think it's a bit more accessible, while also trying to kind of grapple with his own attempt to stay true to what he sets out. So there is a kind of internal critique of Stiegler's work. So it's not sort of one-sidedly on Stiegler's side. So if you're interested in kind of getting to grips with Stiegler, but also thinking about problems in his own ideas. I tried to do both of those things. In terms of where you can find it, so you can get it in all good bookstores. You can straight from State University of New York Press. At the moment, it's only published in hardback. And as we all know, academic hardbacks are incredibly expensive. But it is going to be published in paperback in September. I believe September 3rd. So I think it's around £25, which is far more reasonable. So for most people, I would advise, unless you have an academic library that you would like to order a copy, holding off until September, and then it should be available in kind of just most bookstores.
Are you currently working on another book on Stiegler or something different?
No, not another book. I thought when I finished it that I would not work on Stiegler for a while, but I'm actually sort of writing at the minute, or mostly reading at the minute, but trying to figure out how to make some of his claims about the politics of our capacities in relation to technics a little bit more concrete and legible to people who aren't invested in continental thought. So in particular, one of the concepts he developed is proletarianization, which, to use some of the language we've spoken about, is this idea that we can externalize our capacities, but in doing so, we kind of lose some kind of form of agency, right? That we externalize without any re-internalization or relearning. So he talks about this in a range of contexts historically, and I think intuitively it sort of covers quite nicely a lot of what we experience in kind of modern society. This idea that we become ever more reliant on tools, and there is I think we don't have to read this technophobically. He's saying, how can we use tools in a way which is not kind of proletarianizing? And he talks about general proletarianization, that we're all proletarianized and so on and so forth. And one of the things he's been criticized for is the lack of real distinctions in this claim of generalized proletarianization. And I have a small stab at this in the book with regards to the question of power, violence, with respect to how that relates to the politics of proletarianization. It's sort of purely a knowledge-based thing for him. But I'm currently also working on trying to sort of translate this into the language of a sort of epistemic agency. How do we exercise agency over what we know? Can we do that? And thinking about how this concept of proletarianization fits into those debates, but also in doing so, thinking about actually concretely, how does that harm? And how can we start to differentiate between who is harmed by proletarianization in different ways? So one of his sort of examples that he likes to bring up a lot is Alan Greenspan. In the wake of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, in testimony to Congress, he kind of says, well, yeah, the financial automation meant we were sort of lagging behind what some of the tools are doing for us. And Stiegler sort of says, oh, yeah, Greenspan's proletarianized. He's sort of a symbol of general proletarianization, that these so-called experts are proletarianized. And on one level, that sort of makes sense, right? But I would say that as a result of that proletarianization, financiers probably came off with a slightly different level of harm to people whose mortgages collapsed, right, and whose houses were repossessed, and who committed suicide, right, because of the financial consequences of subprime lending. So trying to find a way to turn that, on the one hand, intuitively useful concept, proletarianization, into something a little bit more kind of tractable in terms of how we are actually kind of harmed by the loss of epistemic capacities, basically. So that's one of the things I'm working on at the moment, which directly stems from Stiegler, but it's sort of drawn on this interest in finding things which resonate with his work in sort of other fields like analytic epistemology, which we wouldn't intuitively relate to Stiegler, but actually think share a lot of concerns.
So you're trying to bring that concrete to the fore so people can intuitively use his work?
Yeah, exactly, right. So maybe say, well, actually, yeah, where can we identify where and how proletarianization has occurred, and to what extent is it a problem in this context.
Mhm.
Trying to turn it into a useful sort of diagnostic tool, basically.
Do you have a site for your work that people can visit?
Yes, yeah, it is. I believe if you search Ben Turner political theory, it comes up on Google. I should know the URL off the top of my head. I can't remember. But yeah, you can read more about my work there, and also further work on that sort of concern about ontology that I've done with reference to anthropology as well. So sort of outside Stiegler, but expressing some of the same concerns.
Okay. Yeah, that seems like a good place to finish up. Yeah, Ben Turner. I'll be sure to put all the links in the description below. But thanks very much. It's been a great conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.